Hello and welcome to Volume 10 of the popular New Horizons series. Portugal is certainly one of the most inexpensive countries in the EC to travel around in, yet it boasts a railway network of considerable diversity and appeal, featuring both broad and narrow gauge systems, much of it single-tracked. And as we shall see, Portuguese railways, the CP stands for Caminhos de Ferro Portugueses, operate an extremely varied and interesting fleet. With a total population of only 10 million people, this lightly inhabited country with its extensive railway network has benefited from a considerable rise in rail investment, particularly since joining the EC. Although today there's no longer any steam to be found, this is more than compensated by some of the unique diesel types, including the Class 1800, the English electric 50s. There's also the equally interesting USA-built 1500 class Alco locos, and some colourful electric classes working the Lisbon to Oporto services. During the course of this programme, we'll also be examining some of the principal freight flows, including spectacular triple heading on Sines coal trains. Finally, there's a look at the extensive and highly scenic Douro Valley network. The location of the capital city of Lisbon on the northern shore of the huge estuary of the River Tagus and the lack of any rail crossing has always had an enormous effect on all potential journeys south, and for the time being at least, all services to the Algarve must start or end at Barreiro. Main intercity services between Barreiro and Faro, the capital of the Algarve, are in the hands of these very obviously French-styled 1931 class diesel-electric locomotives. All told, there are a total of 17 locos in this distinctive class, which were built under licence from Alstom in 1981, basically as a follow-on order to the first 13 examples of the original 1900 class. All the lines south of the River Tagus are officially the southern region of Portuguese railways. Although visually the same as the earlier 1900 class, the 1931 series differs in being fitted for electric train supply and having a higher top speed of 120 km per hour. The locos are designated mixed traffic and frequently turn up on freight turns, as well as this regular twice-daily service to and from the Algarve. This intercity service has only a few intermediate stops and is booked to cover the 288 kilometres between Faro and Barreiro in around 3 hours 40 minutes. About 29 kilometres from Journey's End at Barreiro, this new avoiding line, which was built in 1980, has helped to accelerate intercity services by bypassing the industrial city and fishing port of Setúbal. The end of the line, for the time being at least, is here at Barreiro, where it's necessary to catch one of these ferries to cross the mouth of the Tagus to Lisbon. Pleasant enough for tourists, but hardly conducive to high-speed intercity services. However, in the not-too-distant future, an electrified rail connection will operate via the Tagus Bridge, which is being fitted with a lower rail deck to provide a direct connection to Lisbon. The line immediately south from Barreiro to Setúbal serves a number of dormitory towns and is used mainly by commuters who work in Lisbon. This local stopping service also employs some distinctive motive power, like these old 1500 class USA Alco diesels, originally introduced in 1948. A few local services are also booked to run further south to Funcheira, which involves crossing the River Shardo at the old port of Alcácer do Sal. These characteristic-sounding locos were given a new lease of life during the 1970s, when their original engines were replaced with more powerful Alco diesel engines. Away from the urban areas, the intermediate stations on the line from Barreiro to Faro are connected by what Portuguese railways term regional trains. One typical regional service is this all-station stopping train from Barreiro to Tunes, which is routed via Beja. The level of service provided for this extremely rural area with its sparse population is very poor, with only a few stopping trains a day. Most services are in the hands of these French-built 1200 class diesels, which are these days confined solely to working passenger services on the southern region and to shunting duties around Barreiro. Elderly Swedish-built Nohab railcars are also used on some local services from Tunes to Funchera. First commissioned in 1948, they still perform excellently, offering rapid acceleration and a surprising turn of speed. After pausing at the isolated junction station at Funchera to pick up passengers from the first northbound semi-fast to Barreiro, this unit is setting off on the lengthy journey northeast to Beja and Evora. Incredibly, these elderly units, which feature both first and second class seating, aren't due for immediate withdrawal. Class 1200s are also employed on the more frequent service along the Algarve between Lagos and the Spanish border. This important coastal route provides a useful local passenger service for many of the principal resorts along the Algarve, as well as connecting with the intercity services at Faro and Tunes. Sadly, most of the tourist potential is lost, as nearly all tourists are taken from Faro Airport by coach to the holiday resorts along the Algarve. Although much of the route is slightly inland, there's a short section which runs alongside the sea wall near Faro. One of the main freight traffic flows on the southern region centres on a mineral branch to the Pyrites mine at Neves Corvo, which is situated off the secondary line from Funchera to Beja. Recently, a new station avoiding curve has been completed, which will allow trains to bypass Funchera. But for the time being at least, after running into Funchera from Arreiro, just north of Grandola, with its load of sand and one wagon of cement, the loco will have to run round to gain access to the secondary main line to Beja. The sand is bound for Piotas, a short distance from the mine disposal point on the Neves Corvo branch, where it's used to infill at the Pyrites mine. 5 kilometres from Funchera, the train gets to grips with this stiff climb past Panois, towards the junction for the freight-only branch at Urique. Motive power for both the incoming sand trains and the outgoing Pyrites train are generally drawn from the 1900 class, which were built for dedicated freight use. Members of this class are fitted with dynamic braking and have a lower top speed of 100 km per hour, compared to the later batch of 1931s which we saw earlier at work on the Algarve passenger services. French parentage, with the styling by Paul Arzen, typical of so many locomotives in France, is clearly evident. Problems with the French diesels fitted to these locomotives has resulted in them being derated from their original 3,000 horsepower to 2,700 horsepower. The quiet country station of Urique is the junction where the lengthy Neves Corvo branch turns southeast off the main Funchera to Beja line. Most days there are 2 train loads to and from the Pyrites mine. After dropping the incoming traffic, the 1900 then continues light engine for a short distance to the end of the branch to pick up this typical load of copper and tin Pyrites bound for Praia Chado, near to Setúbal. Ulrich Station is well over 8 kilometres from the town it's supposed to serve, so it's hardly surprising that it sees few passengers for the twice-daily passenger service that remains. The branch itself is comparatively new and was opened with EC assistance in 1991, replacing a closed mine at Algestral. It was laid to high standards using deep ballast and concrete sleepers with a line maximum speed of 80 kilometres an hour. Such is the optimistic long-term future of this lucrative traffic, which represents around 8% of CP's total freight volumes, that the branch is scheduled for electrification around the year 2000, and tenders are currently being sought. Imported coal through the port of Sines on the Atlantic coast is another important traffic flow on the southern region. The branch itself lost its passenger service in 1990, but sees a very heavy daily usage by freight. This pair of 1321 class locomotives are leaving the junction with the main line at Ermadash-Sado at the start of the 48-kilometre run to Sines. The 18 locos in this class were bought second-hand from Spanish railways in 1989. Pego Power Station is the main destination for imported coal. But there's also a booked daily working for a pair of 1321s to take a consignment as far as Setil, where electric motive power will take over for the journey to Susalas or Maceira. The control centre for operations on this picturesque line is in the old station building at Santiago de Casem, which is situated about halfway along the branch. The first train of the day is hauled by a 1500 class Alco heading towards Sines. One of the regular daily coal trains is this short consist bound for the depot at Loulé on the Algarve. As well as coal, Loulé Depot also handles a considerable amount of general freight traffic. Here, another 1500 class shunts the daily pickup service from Faro, which will eventually continue as far as Barreiro. Amongst the regular traffic flows handled here is mineral water, no doubt destined to be consumed mainly by squeamish tourists, afraid to drink the local water supply. Introduced as long ago as 1948, the Alco 1500s are the oldest mainline diesels still in use. During 1996, the first examples of the class were withdrawn, and the remainder are expected to go by the year 2000. When new, they were powerful enough to be used on services north from Lisbon to Oporto, but gravitated south when that line was electrified in 1957. Typical American road switcher parentage is clearly apparent. After nearly 50 years of service, this class has certainly proved to be both reliable and extremely good value for money. This is very much a local pickup service, usually stopping at Faro, Boliquem and Tunes. As the train progresses northward, the consist gets ever more impressive, with extra wagons being added at some of the smaller stations. It's normal practice for the loco which brings the freight from Faro to come off the train here at Tunes, the main junction station on the Algarve with a branch to Lagos. Things are quiet enough in the late afternoon for fuelling to take place literally at the end of the main line through platform. The 1500s are fairly thirsty and can hold up to 2,500 litres. From Tunes, the line starts to gradually climb into the hills which flank the country to the north of the Algarve, and where considerably more tractive effort will be needed. Late evening, this loco is booked to work as far north as Funchera, with the final portion being conveyed to Barreiro in the early hours of the next morning. Further north, the area around Setúbal, with its docks and industrial installations, also sees a considerable amount of freight activity. Because of the lack of a rail link across the Tagus, freight traffic from the more industrialised north has to take a lengthy detour via Setil and Bombel. Approaching Pocerao, which is the junction for the Setúbal avoiding line, is a typical mixed freight from Entroncamento, in the control of a Class 1931. The steel coil in the first wagons has come from Palmita in Spain and is bound for the new Ford motorworks near Pinal Novo. At Pocerao, the 1931 passes a stabled sister locomotive waiting for its next tour of duty. This is not a mixed train, and the passenger coach is returning to Barreiro after having its wheels turned at Entroncamento depot. The daily freight from Entroncamento to Barreiro via Setúbal also provides a useful working to position a Class 1931 locomotive from its home depot at Entroncamento for use on the intercity services from Barreiro to the Algarve. Pinal Novo, just 16 kilometres out from Barreiro, is definitely the hotspot on the southern system. Not only is it well served by passenger trains, but also sees a wide variety of freight. This 1500 class has just come off the branch which leads to the new Ford factory and is heading for Setúbal docks with a rake of cars and vans for export. Branch serving the Ford factory opened in July 1995 and will eventually form part of the link to the new rail bridge over the River Tagus and to Lisbon, which is scheduled to be opened in 1998. Another freight from Entroncamento to Barreiro sees a 1500 Alco piloting a 1400 class English electric diesel. The 1400s are allocated to Entroncamento, but are now also the mainstay of the Barreiro to Setúbal local services. This freight serves as a means for transferring the 1400 after maintenance at Entroncamento, ready for its next tour of duty. Timber traffic is fairly substantial, amounting to some 10% of freight traffic. Approaching Pinal Nova from the west is a 1500 class Alco from Barreiro with a local service for Setúbal. The branch to the new Ford factory can be seen diverging to the left, while in the background is the abandoned Montijo branch. Pinal Novo, like many of the stations in Portugal, features specially commissioned tiled murals depicting local scenes. These often highlight some local noteworthy aspects of daily life, and have usually been produced to a very high standard indeed. Despite their age, and partly because of the favourable climate, most survive in first-class condition. Pinal Novo is one of the few places left on Portuguese railways with operational semaphore signals, and about the only place with a signal gantry worthy of the name. Here another Alco brings in a local from Setúbal. All signals are worked from this rather grand box. It was built in the early 1960s and controls only the immediate area around the station. This is in contrast to much of Portugal, where either new remotely controlled colour light signalling has been installed, or at the other extreme, movements within station confines are controlled by a linesman with a flag. All the Faro to Barreiro intercity trains run straight through Pinal Novo without stopping, as the station is well served by local services. Due to the habit of passengers walking over the running tracks, the train slows to a crawl, and the driver will need to be particularly vigilant. The Portuguese version of the old LMS Blood and Custard livery is carried by all older loco-hauled suburban coaching stock. They were constructed in Spain and are gradually being withdrawn as more of the new stainless steel coaches become available. The best known class of locomotive to work the service between Vila Real on the Algarve coast and Barreiro are the 1800 class, the English electrics. The original class of only 10 locos were a development of the British Rail Class 50s and were built in 1969 by English Electric at Vulcan Foundry near Manchester. In a scene that's rather reminiscent of Dawlish Seawall in the UK, an 1800 works along the coast near Faro at the eastern end of the Algarve. Mornings at Faro provide the opportunity of seeing an additional 1800 hauled working, the once weekly Blue Train from Oporto in the north. This special overnight return working is provided mainly for the benefit of workers who live in the north but have found employment on the Algarve, although the car transporter tends to be used by a few tourists in the know to avoid a very lengthy drive. Many rail fans who are trying to combine a holiday on the Algarve with rail interests make their first contact with Portuguese railways at Faro Station. As this first morning northbound interregional leaves Faro, we catch another glimpse of the Blue Train stabled at the south platform. The Blue Train runs northbound on Friday, returning overnight on Sunday from Oporto, with the 1800 only coming on at Entroncamento. This loco will then join the regular pool to work trains to Barreiro. The 1800s provide traction for all the daily interregional services between Barreiro and the Algarve. This amounts to 2 trains which run during the day and 1 overnight service. They're basically semi-fast stopping trains, which are pathed in between the intercity and local services that we've already examined. All told, the regional and interregional trains account for around 13% of all passenger volumes. The cab layout differs somewhat from the BR Class 50 in having an instrument desk more in keeping with a Class 37 or Class 40 in style. Another major change is the continental style of driver's power controller, which is in the form of a steering wheel. The dead man's control is a foot-operated pedal, which consistently has to be depressed. Although built new with vacuum brakes, all the class were subsequently fitted with train air brakes. Although not a particularly busy main line, there are the occasional local services to cross. At Lulé there's a slight delay to allow a 1200 class diesel with a late-running local Algarve service to cross. Note the Hasler speed and time recorder above the power controller. Despite their age, the locos are well maintained, and every effort is made to keep to the fairly tight timetable. The 1800s arrived on the southern region in 1979, and until the introduction of air-conditioned stock for the intercity services in 1990, they worked the faster intercity services as well as the interregional trains. Even today, their high top speed of 140 km an hour, about 87 miles an hour, makes them the fastest diesels that CP own. Albufeira is a name that's well known to many thousands of holidaymakers, although the station is about 6 kilometres inland from the famous holiday resort and tends to be used mainly by locals. As well as long-distance passenger services, the 1800s also take a share in freight activity south of the Tagus, as well as working a couple of diagrams on the Barreiro to Setúbal locals. The 9 surviving examples average 136,000 kilometres, that's around 85,000 miles a year, which is roughly the same as a Class 50 based at Old Oak Common used to manage. The first 50 kilometres or so along the line from Faro are fairly undemanding, as the route keeps to the lowlands between the mountains and the sea. At Tunesh, a portion of the train from La Gauche at the western end of the Algarve is added to the evening train bound for Barreiro. The attractive junction station here was completed in 1889, the pleasant overall roof being provided to keep the sun rather than the rain off waiting passengers. Although a major railway interchange, the small town offers no facilities in the way of tourist accommodation. The Lagos portions are generally entrusted to 1400 class diesels, which are half-size class 50s or beefed-up versions of the BR class 20, employing the same basic power unit. All told, there's usually much toing and froing across the level crossing before the final consist is made up. Eventually, though, the Class 1800 is able to pull forward to attach its train to the through coaches from Lagos. A different turbocharger arrangement on the engine means that the 1800s sound very similar to, but not quite identical to, a Class 50. A further cause for the difference in sound is the direct drive arrangement for the radiator fan, rather than the electric motor drive used in Class 50s. The 1800s have undoubtedly been one of the best diesels that the CP have bought, although time could well be running out for them on these passenger turns. Current plans are to replace them with 1960s cascaded from the Vila Formoso line in June 1997. The 1800s will then be relegated to freight duties. There's little soundproofing in the spacious cab, and on full power the sound can be very resonant. There's a distinct change in the scenery as the line starts to climb sharply towards the hills of Monchique and Santa Clara Saboya. Allowing for the numerous curves and the extra width of the super elevated broad gauge track, overall line speed is impressive. The track is maintained to a very high standard and the ride is particularly smooth even at speed. Despite the very hilly nature of the terrain, there are only 2 tunnels on the line, including this short section near Santa Clara. This is very poor agricultural land, although even close to the line there's plenty of evidence of the only major agricultural industry in this area, the production of cork. About every 10 years or so, large sections of bark are removed from evergreen oak trees and collected locally for eventual sale as cork. This has always provided a significant source of local income, and its importance has often been recorded in the tiles that adorn many stations. Both the English electric classes are fitted with the melodious 2-tone Desilux horn arrangement. All the class are allocated to Barreiro Depot, and despite their age are popular with most train crews. As distinctive from UK practice, the driver has the benefit of a wing mirror. Perhaps he's worried about being overtaken on the single track. The isolated junction station of Funchera is situated over 2 kilometres away from the small town from which it takes its name, and is where the line to Beja diverges east. Our northbound morning interregional service has a booked connection here with the Nohab unit, which is waiting on the right, with the all stations regional service to Evora. Today's secondary mainline service to Beja follows what was originally the old mainline route to Barreiro. The impressive station here at Funchera was only built in 1919 and is a direct result of the present main line from Barreiro to Alcácer and Ermidas being opened to connect here in 1920. Standard driving practice tends to mean that acceleration from rest to line speed is fairly slow and gradual. Sado is another important junction where the freight-only line to Sinesh diverges to the west, and where the north and southbound morning interregional services are booked to cross. The southbound train is normally the first to arrive. With a working fleet of only 9, it's one of the few opportunities to see two 1800s next to each other. The missing loco from the original batch of 10, number 1809, was involved in a serious derailment in 1984. Although repair work did initially start at Barreiro Works, it was eventually decided to scrap the loco when the true scale of the damage to the bogies was finally discovered. Good maintenance makes it rare for the 1800s to produce a heavy exhaust smoke on full power. The line north from Ermidas benefits from recent colour light signalling installed in 1994 as part of a route upgrading that should climax with this route being electrified in the year 2000. The mainline coaching stock is of the Bud pattern, stainless steel style, built under licence in Portugal by Saw Farm. The similarity to the Class 50 profile is certainly very pronounced, as this 1800 departs Pinal Novo. Journey's End is only a few kilometres away, as 1804 rounds the curve past Barreiro's freight yard. The coaching stock with the green flash denotes an intercity service, in this case the daily round trip from Beja. The station at Barreiro is situated alongside the depot and works. All the class are fitted in the centre of the cab front with connections for multiple unit operation, allowing 2 locos to be driven from one cab, although in practice double heading of this class tends to be very rare. Nostalgic yearnings for the old UK Class 50s makes it easy to see why these powerful and good-looking machines are so popular with English rail fans. Perhaps what is strange is that this distinctive class, in its final sunset, has so far attracted comparatively little interest on the international rail tour front. Barreiro Station is the present terminus for all northbound services and also the connection for ferry services to Lisbon. Released from its stock, this 1800 makes its way past CP's main diesel workshops to the nearby depot and fuelling point. The stabling point is located around the old steam half roundhouse. This 1400 has been prepared for its next turn of duty on a local Barreiro to Setúbal service, which the class took over working about 5 years ago. The centre steeple-type cab offers particularly good all-round visibility. One of the roads is used as a load bank test for the adjacent works and depot. The noise from the various locos on test, including this 1900 class, is often deafening as they're put through their paces after heavy engine repairs. This 1321 class passing by is quite clearly in need of some attention to its power unit. Obtaining quality spares from the USA for these comparatively modern locos has become something of a problem for CP. The maintenance facility at Barreiro comprises of both the depot and a separate workshop. Here, all classes, apart from the 1800s, are stripped down to the frames and totally rebuilt. The body structure on the 1800s doesn't make this possible. This attractive ex-Spanish Alco was bought for use on permanent way work and is currently under repair. Dividing the depot and works is this traverser. CP diagramming provides for regular maintenance and servicing for all diesels, including this 1500 here at Barreiro. This means it's common to see locos travelling in freight consists en route to the works. A total of 17 1500s were bought, split between 2 batches of 12 and 5. They were all re-engined during the 1970s. The present works building is in fact the original Barreiro station terminus, the route having been diverted to the present riverside terminus early this century to avoid an adjacent chemical works. At the back of the works are several Whitcomb-built 1300s, which were contemporaries of the Alcos, but these were all withdrawn by 1987. One of the principal freight flows on the CP takes imported coal on a lengthy journey from Sines on the Atlantic coast to a power station in the eastern Alentejo, at Pego, not far from Abrantes. For the present, the heavy power station coal trains require triple heading on the steeply graded Sines branch itself, although double heading over the rest of the route suffices. motive power for the triple-headed trains is always provided from a special pool of 1900s, which have had their buffers removed and a central Buckeye coupling fitted to allow them to work in multiple. The coal import terminal is situated some way from the town of Sinesh and was purpose-built in the expanding docks area in the 1960s. To make this type of operation viable, huge quantities of coal have to be handled quickly and efficiently, so as not to delay trains on the lengthy single-track sections. Immediately after arriving, the CP locos are uncoupled and move off, allowing the covers to be rolled back before automated loading takes place. It will take about 90 minutes for this powerful battery-powered loco to pull the wagons through at a slow walking pace. All that remains now is to sheet each 100-ton wagon. Despite all the sophisticated automated loading, final preparations still have to be completed by hand. With this type of very slack coal that's burnt in power stations, coal dust being blown around during high-speed transportation on the main lines can often cause problems. Although sheeting is tiresome, the only alternative of half-filling the hoppers would, in the long term, be far more expensive. The climb from sea level is on newly laid track, built with EC assistance during the early 1980s. And despite being well engineered, the gradient out of Sinesh along the branch to the junction with the main line at Ermidash Sado will require the combined tractive effort of these three 1900 locos working in multiple. All told, there are 3 daily diagrams for coal between the port at Sinesh and the power station at Pago. These fully loaded 2,500-ton trains are the heaviest to be found on Portuguese railways. Shortly after leaving the reception sidings, the driver is able to accelerate away from the port at Sinesh and take a glimpse of the Atlantic Ocean before heading inland. After skirting the Atlantic, the line eventually gains height by crossing the main Sinesh to Odemira road over this impressive new viaduct, which is situated close to a local power station. This also consumes imported coal, but because of the short distance from the port, its feed is by a series of lengthy conveyor belts in tunnels. After the branch was closed to passengers in 1990, the connection to the town's railway station was severed by a new ring road. Today all the dock's traffic travels along this new purpose-built diversion, which rejoins the original line just beyond the southeastern outskirts of Sinesh. The branch also serves an oil refinery which is connected via a lengthy spur, but at present most of its supplies are being sent out by road, and the line is mainly used to store redundant tanker wagons. Although closed to passenger traffic for 7 years, the station at Santiago do Cacém remains in extremely good condition, with no damage to any of its superb decorative tiles. Today this is the only manned station on the branch, and the staff are friendly and informative about movements, provided they're approached politely. Most of the triple-headed trains work straight through to Ermidas, but often pass at least one other train, usually here at Santiago on this busy single-track line. To give Pego Power Station a consistent supply, the branch is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Often, the heavy trains can be heard blasting their way up the hill through Santiago during the early hours of the morning. By the way, Santiago is a convenient overnight stop. The abandoned station of São Bartolomeu de Serra, particularly considering it's not been used for nearly 10 years, is also still in incredibly good condition, with virtually no damage or vandalism. The continued use of the branch for freight only is much to the annoyance of some locals, who've made many representations to reopen passenger services. This type of operation, which is crewed by one single driver, is of course very cost effective. On arrival at the mainline station at Ermidas Sado, the leading locomotive of the trio is removed and stabled in the station. It will then be attached to the next empty working headed for Sines. Shortly afterwards, the now double-headed consist begins its mainline journey north. Currently, diesel traction will work either to Setil or Entroncamento, where electric motive power takes over. Currently, electrification of the link line from the Lisbon-Oporto main line at Setil right through to Setúbal is already in progress, and consideration is now being given to electrifying both the Sines and Neves Corvo branches. Powerful 5600 class of electric locomotives used on these services are the newest in traffic on CP. They were built by Sorfarm in Portugal from components delivered by Siemens and are based on the German Class 120s. Although 5600 is the class designation, it's also the continuous power of the class and translates to approximately 7,500 horsepower. The 1931 at the rear of this train isn't a banker, it's merely a positioning move to avoid a light engine movement. Traffic for the power station leaves the main line north to Oporto at Entroncamento and heads east along the Tagus Valley towards Abrantes. The branch to the power station, which runs as an 8-kilometre spur off the line from Abrantes to the Spanish border, was electrified during 1995. Pego is the largest coal-fired power station in Portugal and takes nearly all of the imported coal from the Sines branch. The only other customers for rail-borne coal are two cement works at Sucelas and Maceira. It only takes a few seconds in advance of unloading for the CP motive power to come off the train and rest over on the adjacent line. The wagons will be dragged through the discharge terminal by this unusual cable-assisted loading mule. Unloading is swift and continuous, and the whole train will be discharged and turned around in about 90 minutes. All told, the power station here consumes around 3 million tonnes of imported coal each year. A few words of caution for intending visitors. This traffic can be seasonal. Portugal derives a high proportion of its electricity from hydropower, and after a particularly wet winter, trains are often curtailed or even suspended. Also, plenty of time should be allowed to find the line to the power station, which comes in from the east and not the west, as shown on the Quail map. Other more localised freight traffic can also be found on the route from Abrantes to the Spanish border, including this delivery of sand to a building block manufacturer near Castelo Branco. The 1551 class of locomotive represents an updated version of the older 1500s. All the class are allocated to Entroncamento and work services northeast from there, principally on this route to and from Covila. But also they can be seen on the Lisbon-Oporto main line between Entroncamento and Pampilosa. The view from the Vale de Prazeres on the line to Covila stretches as far as the Spanish border. Surprisingly, it's hilly enough around this part to even have a limited winter sports season. Today at Alpedrina, there are only a few passengers waiting for the afternoon train. Not only has there been a sharp increase in private motorcars, but this type of interregional service also has to contend with a very competitive coach and bus network. Despite this, and the often infrequent service, some trains are still reasonably well patronised. Another problem is that passengers wishing to go through to the end of the line at Guarda will have to change trains. This is because loco-hauled services like this are only able to work to Covila due to weight restrictions beyond there on the extension to Guarda. At Covila, this Allen-built railcar connects with the loco-hauled services to take passengers on for the final part of their journey to Guarda. Beyond Guarda, this sleepy secondary route joins up with the main line from Pampilosa to the Spanish border crossing at Vila Formosa. This cross-border line is currently in the process of being electrified as part of the new international route through Spain to the French border at Irún. For the time being, though, some of the local services on the route are entrusted to these Dutch 0301 class Allen-built railcars. These distinctive vehicles are fitted with rear static braking, and the large structures on the roof are resistance panels used to dissipate the heat. When considering travelling around Portugal, particular attention needs to be paid to accommodation. Although there are a huge number of tourist hotels along the Algarve, many of them totally overrun by English or German sun-seekers, out of the principal cities and towns, accommodation can be totally non-existent or very hard to find. In an effort to at least partially overcome this, the government runs a chain of pousadas, although these work out as being more expensive than conventional hotels. In many areas, the only accommodation will be in very inexpensive penshows, which work out at around £12 per room per night. Other accommodation of variable standards is available in residentials and albergarias. Many villages don't have local shops, but food can usually be obtained from the inevitable local cafe. A phone card to ring home is useful, but the country does support a new digital phone network for those lucky enough to own an international mobile phone. Train services, although reliable, are often infrequent, particularly in the more sparsely populated areas, and great care will be needed in journey planning. Fares are reasonable, but the national timetable is hard to come by except in Lisbon, and is confusing to use, with some services on the same line being split across different timetables. A typical 7-day first-class Rover ticket will cost around £115, although supplements are payable on all intercity trains. Car hire also is very good value, but Portuguese road maps, which are frequently out of date, leave a lot to be desired, and even the otherwise excellent Quail railway map has some mistakes. Some of Portugal's most appealing narrow-gauge operations can be found in the remaining portion of the Val de Voga network. This runs from the Lisbon to Oporto main line at Aveiro, via a loop through Senada de Vuga and back to the same main line at the seaside town of Esfino. The southern end of the narrow-gauge line meets up with the broad-gauge main line here at the busy coastal town of Aveiro. The line was originally built to serve a large, sparsely populated area that couldn't possibly justify the cost of a standard broad-gauge service. Three-car DMUs which were bought from Yugoslavia were refurbished during 1993, especially for use on the Val de Voga system, and the blue livery of these units is distinctive to this line. These units were refurbished at the brand new workshops at Castoes on the outskirts of Oporto, specifically for this commuter traffic in 1993. The Aveiro to Senada section passes through a very rural landscape, and the service frequency is not as great as on the northern section from Senada to Esfino. The traditional diesel power on this system is still provided by meter gauge versions of the standard gauge Allen rail cars, which on some services tow a single trailer car. The line has always attracted considerable interest from rail fans, particularly during the later steam days. Today there's a small museum at Maquinata de Voga, which features both steam and diesel motive power that was formerly used on this system. As the driver approaches Senada de Voga from the south, the linesman's flag tells him that he's cleared for the final approach to the station over a very unusual bridge. This combined road-rail bridge is not totally unique. There was another similar one at Pocinho on the now closed Sable line. Even in Portugal, traffic isn't allowed to use the bridge at the same time as the train. The network used to branch off east here at Senada de Voga for the important inland spa town of Visu. It then ran on to eventually connect at Santa Combo Dao with the main Pampilosa to Guarda main line, but sadly this section was closed in 1989. The Senada de Voga network was first opened in 2 stages, with the final sections being completed in 1914, by which time it boasted no less than 74 stations. Despite the closure of the Viseu section, to some extent it has led a charmed life. At the end of steam in 1972, the whole system was temporarily closed as a short-term economy measure, but fortunately the remaining sections resumed service in 1975. However, narrow-gauge operations like this are constantly under review, and the CP are currently seeking a private operator to take over this network, so it would be wise to sample its undoubted charms without delay. This fine structure was in fact a purpose-built rail bridge, later converted to a dual road bridge. Today there are no through workings along the entire length of the remaining system, and most trains terminate at Senada de Voga. Many of the trains have also been bus-detuted, as have all the evening services. When the line to Viseu and beyond was open, Sonada de Virgo was a bustling junction station. Today the workshops and main depot for this small system are still based at this now sleepy station. Sadly, there's no longer any commercial freight traffic for this attractive 9021 diesel to work. Still, at certain times of the day the station can get surprisingly busy as stock is moved around to form the different services. Waiting CP-owned buses on the station forecourt now provide the public transport connection to Viseu. North of Sonada, the line climbs steeply out of the river valley to the major town of Oliveira de Azimes. Despite this sign, the line hasn't seen steam for over 20 years. The state of the track on this little system leaves something to be desired in places. Nevertheless, its quaint character is very appealing. This section from Oliveira to Espino does carry a relatively heavy weekday commuter traffic, which then feeds into the mainline services to Oporto. So the long-term future of at least this portion of the original network does look fairly secure. The capital city of Lisbon, with its amazing network of cobbled streets and steep hills, is well worth visiting, both from a general interest and a railway point of view. Although 86% of CP's passenger volume comes in the form of suburban passenger receipts, and despite being a city that's extremely well served by a vast array of different public transport methods, Lisbon city centre is totally choked by private motor cars. The Estoril line, which runs from Lisbon's Caminhos de Ferro station to Cascais and the seaside resort of Estoril, was the first section of the CP to be electrified during the 1920s, and it still employs 1500 volts DC overhead supply. This route was only nationalised in 1976, and many of the Budd-designed units date back to the early 1960s. Today, up to 7 car formations are used to operate this intensive service. The route from Lisbon's Rosio station to Sintra was the subject of a full revamp during the early 1990s. New rolling stock was provided, built at the Solfaim works just outside Lisbon using ABB equipment. The line runs for 27 kilometres to the resort town of Sintra and was electrified as long ago as 1957. The impressive Rosio station is a mock manual line building, with the actual train shed and platforms being gained by some rather improbable escalators through a shopping mall. The station was built in 1910 and extensively refurbished in the early 90s. Lisbon also has the benefit of a metro system, the basic configuration of which is currently U-shaped, but is undergoing considerable extension. Rather strangely, it's built to the standard 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge, completely out of character with the rest of the country's broad and narrow gauges. Work began as long ago as 1955, and the line was built using the cut and fill method. Currently, Rosio is the only CP station which is linked to the tube network. No visit to Lisbon would be complete without a ride on one of its famous trams, some of which have electrical equipment built by Dick Kerr of Preston, dating back before the First World War. Sadly, many of the tram routes have now been abandoned, although the principal services along the coast towards Estoril survive. Many trams have been modernised, and they're extremely popular with both visitors and locals. Investment is continuing. These new units were commissioned in 1995. Lisbon is built on a switchback of hills, and several funicular railways like this one near Rosio station help ease the strain for pedestrians. Santa Apollonia is Lisbon's principal station and the terminus for intercity services to Oporto and other parts of eastern and northern Portugal, as well as the international services from Madrid and Paris. Only 11 years separate the different design philosophies of these two equally distinctive generations of electric locomotives. The clear French influence of the 2600 class and the later build of 9 locomotives numbered from 2621 upwards is once again evident. The first batch of 12 were built in 1974. The 2551s, which were state-of-the-art in 1963, have the same stainless steel fluted body side as the Bud pattern coaches, giving a totally integrated and almost American streamlined look, albeit perhaps a bit dated these days. These are the second class of AC electric locomotives built for use on the CP, and have the same electrical equipment as their predecessors, the 2500 class, which also still survive, although these days they're confined to freight services. At present, out of a total network of just over 3,000 kilometres, little more than 460 have been electrified, while the main line to Oporto is the only route in Portugal to feature double-running broad-gauge electrified track. Portuguese Railways operates a car-carrying service for passengers travelling between Lisbon and Covilhã and the second city of Oporto. Loading is carried out at Santa Apollonia station, with services departing every 3 hours or so for the 337-kilometre journey. The car-carrying aspect of the Lisbon-Oporto service is not particularly well patronised, as the journey time of nearly 4.5 hours is further increased by the extra time needed to load and unload the car transporter. In contrast to Swiss drive-on and off services, passengers here have to report several hours before departure, and then occupy themselves before the train sets off. However, the less than restful road journey, which is now busy motorway all the way to Oporto, only takes around 3 hours. Sadly, a considerable saving on the total time taken if you choose to let the train take the strain. The 2600 class tend to share the Lisbon-Oporto turn with the class 5600. The services between Lisbon and Oporto comprise a mixture of both air-conditioned and non-air-conditioned stock, depending on the type of service. All the recently produced stainless steel coaches were made by Soffarm and are basically French Conrail coaches that are air-conditioned. Soffarm are now the only manufacturers of stainless steel rolling stock in the world, and have recently even made some body shells for export to California. At present, this is Portugal's only principal main line, and it was electrified in 1957 to 25,000 kilovolts AC. Through services from Madrid-Marval means that some Spanish coaching stock works through to Lisbon on the Sud Express, while other Spanish coaches are merely hired in to help with a temporary shortage of rolling stock. Railways were late arriving and generally slow to develop in Portugal, although the potential of this route north to the second city of Oporto was quickly realised. The first part opened in 1856 and continued in stages until Oporto was reached in 1865. The broad gauge of 5 foot 6 inches was chosen as a result of wanting to integrate with the neighbouring Spanish network. Ironically, consideration is currently being given to converting at least the main international routes to the standard European gauge. At present, intercity services like these only account for 1% of total passenger volumes. However, 1998 should see the introduction of Fiat-built Pendolinos, or tilting trains, over this route. This will offer a reduction in the Lisbon-Oporto journey time from the present 3-hour best to around 2 hours, and hopefully a big increase in passengers. Electric multiple units provide a regional service linking the intermediate local stations between Lisbon and Entroncamento. They were built during the early 1960s by Saw Farm. The 2600 class have a dual gearing arrangement so that they can provide either high-speed passenger haulage or extra tractive effort for freight use. Like their diesel counterparts of classes 1900 and 1931, the driver is provided with a bar stool type of loose seat, which isn't even fixed to the floor. Understandably, these are not very popular with train crews, and after many complaints, CP are now to equip these locos with conventional fixed seats. One of the main stations between Lisbon and Oporto is Entroncamento, where this plinth loco is something of a station hallmark. Built in 1881, Loco 135 suffered this ignominious end in 1986. Entroncamento literally means junction in Portuguese, and this is very much a railway hotspot, with services passing through on the Lisbon to Oporto main line, as well as serving the branches which head off east from here towards the Spanish border. Freight avoiding lines run on the north side of the station, whilst there's a large depot and works complex at the western end, in addition to the CP's engineering training school and a permanent way depot. Motive power to be seen here is almost exclusively electric these days, apart from movements to get diesels onto the depot for maintenance. There are hourly local services calling at all stations to Oporto, as well as east to Abrantes. All this fleet of EMUs are maintained here at Entroncamento, which still supports a considerable railway workforce, in addition to being the outer limit for commuters from Lisbon. Station shunters, which have a somewhat familiar line, are Rolls-Royce Sentinels, which were built locally in Portugal. The main line from Oporto to Lisbon is Portugal's busiest freight artery, and a tremendous variety of traffics can usually be seen on most weekdays, including wood from the Alentejo region. Portuguese railways appear to be running counter to the trend in the rest of Europe, and have actually seen a steady growth in freight tonnages since 1990, when local goods facilities were generally withdrawn. Although built initially to match passenger rolling stock, these days the 2551 class are often found employed on freight workings, including this southbound trainload of hoppers near Villafranca. CP's most important freight flow is cement. All told, this accounts for 28% of all traffics. The 1957-built 2500 class are the forerunners of the stainless steel-bodied electrics that we glimpsed at Lisbon on passenger duties. All 15 of the 2500s are now confined to freight duties. Not all the 2500s, like this one on a northbound aggregate train, carry the standard livery. This is a comparatively recent variation in paint style. There are 30 5600 class electrics, 15 of which were built for potential conversion to 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge. Spanish railways also have an identical class of locos. Although these fine locos have a top speed of 220 km an hour, they're equally at home on heavy freights and were designed to haul a 1,000-ton freight train up a 16mm gradient at 80 km an hour. The class is based on what Siemens call their Eurolock design and were first introduced in 1993. The target annual revenue earning distance is 240,000 kilometres, at a predicted failure rate of one failure every 250,000 kilometres, offering 92% availability. 5601 is named Entroncamento after the depot and is the only named CP locomotive. This pair of English Electric 1400s are approaching Oporto's Campana station, having just crossed over the river Douro. Only the first 10 of this class were built at Vulcan Foundry, the remaining 57 being assembled at Saw Farm, using components supplied from Britain. They are the most numerous locomotive class found on the CP and have been very successful. Campana is the main station in Oporto, where the intercity services from Lisbon terminate. For such an important town, the station, which was rebuilt in the 1960s, is rather plain. No need for footbridges or subways here. Campana is a through station, but only trains from the north are able to continue into the city centre to use the terminal at São Bento station. Local services for commuters are mainly in the hands of these 2151 class EMUs. This is a typical all stations outer suburban from Aveiro. Plans to upgrade Campana station include adding a further 6 tracks to the existing 10 and incorporating a new integrated bus terminal. 1400s working services through from the Douro Valley with their red and white Swiss-built coaches all call at Campana. Plans are currently underway to electrify the first part of the line to the Douro Valley, which carries the largest number of commuters, and this will mean that all services from Marco will soon be operated by EMUs. This corridor, linking the western end of the Douro to Oporto, generates enough traffic to warrant 1400s working in pairs on many of the morning and evening peak trains. São Bento station is more central than Campana, which is out at the eastern edge of the city, and is also the terminus for services from the Douro and other points northward. In a city that's famed for its beautiful mural tiles, the thousands of commuters that pass through here each day appear to be largely oblivious to this magnificently ornate booking hall. The mainly blue and white tiles depict historic and rural scenes, below a coloured frieze portraying the development of transport in Portugal. The tiles were painted in 1930 by Jorge Colico, and today are something of a tourist attraction. Only a few of the murals depict anything of railway interest, but it's noticeable that the locos featured don't show the same detail and accuracy as the other scenes. As well as services to the Douro Valley commencing here, trains which are generally DMU worked also depart for the north, to Viana do Castelo and Valença, and then on over the border into Spain. The station also handles a heavy suburban traffic from the Oporto hinterland. Most of the first 3 kilometres up to the main Campana station are in a tunnel that commences at the end of the platforms here at São Bento. The Douro Valley line, which runs from Ermesinde at the junction of the Oporto to Valença main line, closely follows the Douro River towards the Spanish border, and unquestionably offers the most scenic railway journey in the whole of Portugal. Régua is an important staging point about halfway along the route. It's the end of the Oporto outer suburban network traffic and is also the terminus of the meter gauge branch from Vila Real. The line was built in stages between 1875 and 1887 and used to provide a through route to Spain via Barca de Alva at the frontier. But cross-border traffic ceased in 1988 when Spanish Railways decided to withdraw its connecting services. Although the turntable at Régua is still in use, most of the roads which lead off it contain dumped meter-gauge steam locomotives, which last saw service during the late 1970s. 11 examples remain, although 2 have been bought privately and restored for service in France and Austria. Due to Portugal's temperate climate, most of the locomotives are reasonably intact, although they naturally show some superficial signs of decay. The Douro was one of Portugal's last broad gauge routes to retain steam. During the late 1970s, this line in particular became very popular with many hundreds of European rail fans. Starved of steam on their own national networks, they were able to find plenty of everyday action here. During those last days of steam, crews were always willing to turn locos to order, and were often just as pleased to share a glass or two of the local wine. All the broad gauge locos, apart from a diminutive 040 well tank, were oil-fired. This is the daily mixed Cocino to Regua, shown in the timetable as the Misto. The strange fanning of the smoke is caused by a block of wood pushed across the chimney to deflect the smoke when running under electric wires. 6 members of this class, including 292 passing over the River Tua, were fitted with smoke deflectors. Such was the leisurely progress of the railway back in 1973 that this particular train was booked to cover 107 kilometres in 4.5 hours, although on this occasion it was an additional 3 hours late by journey's end. The next day, number 282 was en route to Barca de Alva, the border station which is now closed. Although the daily passenger trains from Oporto were diesel-hauled, steam had to take over at Regua because the viaducts to the east were not passed for diesel traction. Sadly, despite recent efforts, there is no sign of any preserved mainline steam in Portugal at present. Leaving Tua, number 286, built in 1910 by Henschel, proceeds east with a typical mixed train, including passenger coaches at the rear. Like so many of the intermediate stations in Portugal, the one at Regua is often a lively place with a busy cafe and bar. All the 1400s that are used on the valley services, like this one bound for Tua, are based at Contumil in the suburbs of Oporto. The station here also contains several bay platforms on the left of this picture, which were built to serve the meter gauge branch to Chaves. However, that service was cut back to Vila Real in 1990. The narrow gauge line to Vila Real follows the valley of the River Corgo and is worked by these interesting units that were bought from Yugoslavia. Originally built in the 1960s for the 760mm Yugoslavian gauge, they were converted to meter gauge by CP in the 1980s. Back on the main broad gauge line and some 27 kilometres along the valley from Regua, Pinau is one of the most famous and distinctive stations in the region. The station here is renowned for its tiled murals, which attract visits from tourists not even travelling by train. The scenes generally depict wine growing. Pinau is, of course, one of the central points for viticulture in the Douro, and until the 1960s, the railway was used extensively to transport both grape pickers and wine. Even today, there is no major through road to directly link the small towns along the Douro Valley. However, in the late 1980s, a new road linking Oporto to Mirandela and the Spanish border was built to motorway standards. Inevitably, this has had a considerable effect on all passenger receipts, as it's now far quicker to travel out of the valley and join the new road. This is one of the most impoverished and isolated parts of Portugal, where the way of life for many agricultural workers has literally not changed for many centuries. The soil is very poor, and with so little rain but a temperate climate, the main crop is inevitably grapes, mainly for port and some local wine. Just before Tua station, the River Tua enters the Douro. It's still just as attractive as during steam days, when this was one of the favourite locations on the line. Porcino to Oporto passenger services connected to a station, with a meter gauge line that strikes northwards as far as Mirandela. Although nowhere near as popular as in the late 1970s, nevertheless, at certain times of day, this isolated station can still be surprisingly busy with transferring passengers. All the infrastructure relating to the transfer of freight between the meter and broad gauge, including derricks and wagon turntables, remain in place. However, the freight services have long gone. The service to Mirandela is the last of the narrow gauge lines to retain loco-hauled trains, although rail cars were being introduced towards the end of 1996. This is one of the 10 9021 class locos built in 1976. The line climbs steeply out of Tua station, running parallel with the broad gauge line to Regua before branching off to the north. With comparatively lightweight coaches in tow, the 9021s, which are fitted with 1,000 horsepower Alston diesel engines, are well equipped for the steady climb. Engineering on this route is very spectacular, with the railway clinging to the valley side. Of necessity, speed is low, and the 54-kilometre journey to Mirandela will take around 2 hours. The line used to go through to Bragança, but was cut back in 1993, saving a distance of 80 kilometres. Today, the connection onward to Bragança must be made by one of CP's buses, and will take another 2 hours or so. All the intermediate stations, including the one at Abrero, are unstaffed. Considering the remote nature of the stations, often far from the villages they serve, it's surprising just how many passengers are often waiting for the train. The scenery in the Tua Gorge is arguably the most spectacular to be found anywhere on the CP network. The decline in narrow gauge traffic means that currently there are only 21 of these Schindler Swiss-built coaches left in service, most of the other routes being worked by railcars of various types. All 4 of the original meter gauge lines which ran north from the Douro took their names from the river valleys which they followed. Although unstaffed for many years, Brunhilde still looks spick and span for the occasional customer who cares to walk the 3 kilometres from the village along a very rough and muddy track. The 10 examples of the 9021 class of diesels are now the only meter-gauge locomotives retained by the CP, an earlier batch being sold to Angola during 1994. 5 are based here, and the others are scattered around the remaining narrow-gauge lines for works use. All the potential energy of the River Tua will not be wasted as it feeds into the Douro, which is extensively dammed for hydroelectric generation. The goods van is carried on all services and is quite heavily used for parcels traffic to Mirandela. Today, all services terminate here at the attractive town of Mirandela. During the last few years, part of the route north to Bragança has recently been revived as a light rapid transit system for the town, and both lines now share a new maintenance shed about 5 kilometres out of town. traffic on the main Regue to Porcino broad gauge line has also had to adapt to some major changes, and the original Ferradosa station is now stranded on the opposite riverbank to the line. It's nearly 20 years since the new deviation was built, but the original bridge abutments across the river at Ferradosa are still evident. The new route became necessary because, during the 1970s and 80s, one of the numerous new dams was built close by, considerably raising the level of this part of the river. Here, the first Oporto to Porcino service of the day negotiates the new alignments at Ferradosa. Once it was possible to travel on to Spain, or even continue northeast for another 105 kilometres by narrow gauge from Porcino to Duas Ingrejas. Incredibly, some freight traffic in the form of cement survives to travel along the full length of the Douro to the terminal at Porcino. The ubiquitous 1400s also have charge of all freight services along this route. Pulling away from Tua, this normally twice-weekly service passes by the Locoman's overnight dormitory hostel that was used in steam days. Today, Porcino is a sleepy station, where all services, including passenger, must terminate. Its role as an interchange station to Duas Ingrejas is now just a ghostly memory, as this line was closed in the late 1980s. We hope that you've enjoyed this look at the railways of Portugal. The Portuguese railways are presently undergoing tremendous change. Although there's continuous new investment, there's also considerable pressure to eradicate huge losses, and some of the lines we've looked at in this programme, particularly the narrow gauge routes, are under constant threat of closure and should be visited without delay. As we've said before, Portugal, with its distinct lack of rural accommodation, may not be the easiest of countries to travel in off the beaten track, but as we hope that we've demonstrated, it can certainly be well worth the effort. Be sure to look out for the next volume in this exciting series, which features Switzerland. Bye for now.